Fat Boys, we're well into the thick of things. We got a bunch of teams just fishing around that 500 level, and week 9 was going to help level us out to see who is just above and who is just below the Mendoza line. So without further ado, let's get right into the NFL news, and then we'll get right into our week 9 results. Week 9 in the NFL is always a funky one because for them in the actual league, they're on the second half, but they still have a fair bit to play for. In fantasy, we only have a few more weeks realistically, and you're going to start to notice over the next couple weeks that some teams may even start to clinch, which means the playoff run is very much in full swing, making the trade deadline actually a really, really interesting timing for us. Now, trades we've talked about for the last couple weeks, but this particular week, right by the deadline, we've seen in the last little bit tons of talent change hands. Now, sometimes these are defensive talents, and that's something to pay attention to, obviously, for our team defenses and matchups, etc. But honestly, we're going to be swung by some of the talent that's going through. Now, there was a running back I can think of, but mainly this is wide receivers. But just in general, this kind of gives us an idea of who the buyers and who are the sellers. Obviously, in fantasy, there's a few different ways this can be of value. If a team trades away their number 1 and you have their number 2, I mean, even though we're going to talk about the trade away teams in a second here, there's always fringe benefit. I mean, they got to score sometime. But then obviously, if you got the person, it's always the question of whether or not they can mesh. Now, if you happen to have Hopkins, obviously you're pretty pumped. He came out and had a great Monday night. I mean, I would assume you're happy that he's getting tosses from Holmes as opposed to whoever Tennessee was lining up, whether it was Billy Jeans or a sub. But you're looking at the Steelers, the Ravens, the Chiefs, Washington, Buffalo, Cowboys, Cincinnati, and Minnesota all as buyers in some way, shape, or form. Now, in some cases, it's more than one player, and I think the Steelers and Ravens have made a very key point that they're going for it on this one. Steelers even more interesting. They had one George Pickens, so they decided why not get 2? You know, maybe they're going for the whole 3 and layup strategy of basketball, where it's either run game, which has been solid, or air it out because they can't really seem to throw the mid-rangers. Chiefs, we already talked about. Bills have been interesting because that one's been a couple weeks, and that's been up and down, even though the market value on that one, the amount of money they're paying that particular receiver in Cooper is probably going to work out. I think the weirdest one, I mean, Cincinnati going for a backup running back is smart, but, I mean, the Cowboys and Mingo? Kind of thought they'd be sellers, not buyers. Speaking of sellers, we have some people that we might assume. Now, these are also, the 2-win teams are very much represented. Just to point out, if you haven't noticed, every team in the league has at least 2 wins, which is quite a rarity at this point in time. That's New England, Miami, Cleveland, Jacksonville, Tennessee, Vegas, the Giants, and the Saints. And you're going to hear a couple of those names again because of the Browns, Vegas, you got Carolina, you got New Orleans, you got Tennessee, Jacksonville. They're all sellers. Throw Chicago in there too because they just got rid of some talent. And these are all teams that are looking to kind of make a change. Maybe some of them were teams that a couple weeks ago thought they might have a run. And I mean, even with Cleveland, now they have a quarterback who throws touchdowns. Unfortunately, he also throws a lot of interceptions. Congrats on that one, Winston. He passed the 100 mark. He now has 102 interceptions. The Saints, I mean, what a rough week because not only do you lose your primary wide receiver in Olave, but your quarterback's kind of riddled in a bit of an odd situation. A stat that came out that I think is hilarious that some people may have already looked at. If you look at starting quarterbacks after so many seasons, so starting quarterbacks with the most amount of losses after 4 seasons is actually Derek Carr. David Carr. I'm eventually going to get those right. David Carr after 4 seasons, after 5 seasons, and after 6 seasons. Once we get to 7 seasons, then he passes the baton off to Derek, the one who I keep calling David or Derek and whatever. And that's 8 seasons, 9 seasons, 10 seasons. And then in the 11th season, Derek Carr is currently tied with Archie Manning. Smart Money says he might just pass him. But not only are you in that stat, but you also have to get just absolutely thrashed by one of your former wide receivers. So kind of a rough week all around, aside from the fact that you just got beat by one of those other now 2-win teams. The only team I didn't mention because they're a buyer and a seller, that's our good old Jets. We spent a lot of time talking about them anyway in the past couple weeks, but Rodgers essentially just gets what Rodgers wants. So he got his friend in at receiver who's doing okay and I think steadily better as the week goes on. And he got rid of this receiver he didn't like, who ran routes that he didn't appreciate. He also may, who knows, maybe he won't even finish the season because now his buddy's probably also going to be the head of the CDC by the end of this thing, taking fluoride out of the water. But let's not make this political. I think we've had a rough enough day in general. And football is actually a nice discourse away from all that. Speaking of which, we do have a lot to talk about, and there's a bunch of stuff to look forward to week 10. So let's get right to our team week breakdowns. In the battle of the switching of names and also two teams that really did need this win coming out of the 500 spot, we did have Justin prevail. Now, Justin had a handful of great performances. Lamar was our quarterback 4. You actually had our running back 1 in Barkley also produce one of the best athletic things I've seen, that reverse hurdle or the revertal. Take a look at it if you haven't seen it, gentlemen, but also maybe look at the sidelines when it happens because the players go crazy, which is always a good sign. You also had the tight end 3 in Kelsey, so you got to be happy that he's starting to produce a little bit more consistently. And then people like Sutton put up a great point. Your receivers actually all over produced, so you did have a few smaller areas, but nothing like a massive underperformance. And you did actually even have Eckler on the bench. It was not all loss for Whalen. You did actually go over your predictage, and you would have beaten quite a few people, just not the one you needed to. You had the wide receiver 3, you had the running back 4, and Dobbins, who was just outside of it. So really you were let down by kind of your tight end, your flexes. I'd say Brown's injury was also a massive issue. Don't know if it would have covered for 28 points. Also, I mean, Kansas City's defense has been a point getter for you, and the fact that they just went against an offense that apparently doesn't need its 2 best wide receivers to still occasionally score some points. So tough one for you because, Whalen, all the wins and losses are going to matter here when we're around the 500 mark, whereas Justin, not only was this a win, it was a high score, which puts a kind of a double whammy on it. So congrats, pal, you're top 4 right now. In a fairly significant and huge matchup here, Jake hangs on to the number 1 seed, whereas Horace takes the loss, but only drops as low as 3rd. Horace, we'll start with you quick. I'm in a few other leagues, obviously, here, and you had to be happy with Allen's performance. It was just outside of the top 5. But other people did not necessarily trust Hopkins in his first week. You did, and congrats, because you got the wide receiver 4 performance out of it. You guys didn't have a whole lot on the bench, although I think we could look at maybe some of the underperformances down here, but you didn't really have the people to take that up, Horst. Whereas Jake, you scored just fine, obviously 30 over your predicted and 2nd overall. Olave, though, has to have you concerned. That's a few too many concussions, and let's see how and when he tries to return. And you did have some wide receivers on the bench, but obviously you weren't going to assume that he got knocked out mid-game. Your running backs were steady, and Stevenson you got to be happy with, but Cade Otton was our tight end too, so you got to be even happier. You had the defense too in the Chargers. And finally, you got a good Mahomes performance out of him. He was our quarterback 5. So like I said, obviously, Horst, you would have wanted the win, but you still hang on to a top 3 spot. And Jake, that's a pretty big power win, huge points, and the W. You stay on the top spot. There have been weeks that 138 plus actually get you the top score of the week, but not this one. But Will, even though you were the 3rd, you definitely bumped into the right opponent here. Chaz was exactly pretty much right on his predicted. Now, in terms of Chaz here, you did have our running back 2, and HN seems to just be a lot better with Tua in the lineup. You didn't have a whole lot of other options as far as I can tell. Obviously, Kyler Murray, you made the right call with Williams, and that wasn't really a game breaker, though, for you either way, especially when you're going to get up against Will, who had our quarterback 2, and Zay Flowers with our wide receiver 2. He definitely seems to be on or off. That allowed you to put up with some kind of performances from your running backs that were well under what they were meant to do, although they were both supposed to have pretty significant weeks. They just didn't. Tight end did great. Pollard's been a huge plus, so all things considered, Will, you can't be too feisty on that one. Plus the win, it does put you in the top 6. Jazz, as I mentioned, you're not technically out of it yet, but you better start your run soon. Seems to be more of a double whammy when Ben can win, and it's either Burrow or CeeDee Lamb that actually do it for him. In this case, it was Burrow. He was our quarterback one. You also had to deal with some adversity on your team. I mean, you look even at your running backs. One massively underperformed. One was our running back 5. Wide receivers, you had a couple up top that at least held their own, even if they were just above or below predicted. Whereas you had your flex who got kicked out of the game for punching a helmet. I don't really understand that one. Someone's going to have to walk me through it. When someone punches a helmet, is anyone taking that seriously? They probably break their hand anyway, and then they get kicked out. That's rough. Mark, kind of a fall from grace here, pal. You are kind of sliding down and now becoming a little bit more mortal. You hang on to your number 2 spot, but we're going to see that there's some people now definitely within your grasp. You did have the running back 2 performance with Henry. You also had a solid defensive outing with the Jets. They're our defense 4. So not all is lost here, but you're definitely going to want to turn it around. Now you're back with the rest of us, so you want to make sure you go back on that run till you get that clinching spot for the playoffs. Ben, for you, this was a big one. I know the 9th isn't what you're looking for, but as we're going to see in the standings, it is not off by much, and you're actually quite tied in the places you want to be, so you're right in the thick of it. Speaking about 2 teams who massively needed a win but yet came out and had just horrible performances, I would have only beaten 2 people. Fortunately for me, I was playing one of them. B, you wouldn't have beat anyone. I think you had our low score, so not much you can do there. Now, we did actually have a bit of tension, and I watched the Monday Nighter with a little bit of, urgency. I had a bit of a lead. I did have a 73% chance of winning it going into the game. I had a 12.25 point lead. You had Baker. I had Hunt. There was a time when I was a little bit worried about that, and then the last 2 or 3 drives, they just gave it to Hunt. Force fed him, got the 100 yards, got the touchdown, and then my heart could beat a little bit more calmly. Didn't really have anyone from my end or even yours necessarily that were going to crack the top 5, although we did have, like I said, some kind of good and bad performances. I'd say the biggest thing, though, if I had to point a finger there, that's got to be your wide receivers. Those were not the performances you needed. Now, you did, sadly, for you, have some points on the bench. I think Dax was a good omission, but Chuba and Tank might have been able to help you out here, might have just been enough if you put them both in to get you on the top. However, ifs, buts, candy, nuts, you're just outside of the playoffs now, but as we're going to see in just a minute, it's not like you're far off. If you're 500 as of right now, you're in the playoffs. If you're 4 and 5 or just below, then you better be Will, because he's the highest scorer of all the 4 and 5s. But what that means, it's really going to come down, as I say pretty much every week, who you playing and who they got. Speaking of Will, if you want to chill out for a week, that would be awesome. I need this more than you do, probably. I don't actually know that, but if everyone that's 4 and 5 loses, then you still stay in the playoffs. So come on, man, help me out. 7 and 8 matchup, obviously that's key. We've also gotta love when this happens, 1 versus 2. We get a mock finals in week 10, which is pretty exciting. And then obviously we've got some teams just in the playoffs with some teams that are looking to make a run. So everything's up in the air. Everything's up for grabs. Going to be a great week. Let's see how week 10 unfolds. Same, but different. Every week it's the same story. Another kind of hodgepodge of wins and losses that put us all kind of tied and coming down to the strokes here. Speaking of which, we only have a few weeks left. We're going to start to see those little stars go in as people start earning their spots into the playoffs in the upcoming weeks. I don't think we're in danger of that right away, but I could be wrong. Want to pay attention to games? We are just insulting the Germans this week with the Giants and the Panthers. I'll give you $20 if you can make it through the game without falling asleep. Unless you got a ton of those players, in which case I hope you're playing me. Actually, I don't. Not this week. They actually might both. Maybe 2 wrongs make a right, and Lisa Simpson was right. We do have some bye week issues for a lot of us here. We got the Browns, we got the Packers, we got Vegas, and we have Seattle. So if you have any of those members, likely you're going to want to make some moves because with a short bench, you might not have the people to cover it. So as always, we're getting close into the thick, so I'm going to wish everyone good luck, but I'm not really going to mean it. But here I am going again. Good luck, everyone, in Week 10.